You've held a sheet of printer paper thousands of times, but who decided it should be exactly that size and not, say, a little wider or a little taller? And why does changing it still cause arguments between entire continents? The size of a piece of paper was not handed down by some universal law of geometry. It was fought over by governments, ignored by manufacturers, rescued by a physicist's margin note, and nearly replaced by a rival system that most of the world has now completely forgotten, except for the one country still using it. To find where this actually starts, you have to go back to the paper mills of 17th century Europe, where paper was still made by hand, one sheet at a time. The process was physical and surprisingly personal. A craftsman would dip a rectangular wire mold into a vat of pulp, lift it out, and let the water drain through. The size of the mold determined the size of the sheet, and mold sizes were not standardized. They were whatever the mill happened to build, passed down from master to apprentice, varying by region, by guild, by the whims of individual papermakers. In the Papal States, the city of Bologna had developed a sheet they called the imperiale, roughly 74 by 50 centimeters. In the German principalities, there were at least a dozen competing sizes, named with words like Kanzlei and Konzept that described their use rather than their dimensions. In England, the Crown had its own formats. No two kingdoms fully agreed. The result was that a document written in one city might not fold neatly into the envelopes, ledgers, or printing presses of another city. Scribes and printers absorbed the inefficiency as a cost of doing business because there was no other way. What's striking is that this chaos was stable. Nobody pushed for a fix because the people who could have pushed, the papermakers, had no incentive to shrink their variety. Each size served a local market, and local markets were the only markets most mills had. The pressure to standardize required something papermakers couldn't generate themselves, a centralized government with enough reach to force the question. And that is exactly what arrived in France in 1789. The French Revolution did not set out to standardize paper. It set out to standardize everything else: weights, measures, currency, administrative districts, and paper got caught in the current. By 1794, the new Republican government had issued a decree establishing official formats for administrative documents. The motivation was not elegance, it was control. A centralized state needed uniform paperwork to function across its newly reorganized departments. The decree specified 4 formats, named numerically, and anchored to metric dimensions that the Republic had also just invented. This was the first time a government had tried to impose a rational, top-down paper size system on a working industry. And it almost immediately ran into the same problem every standardization effort runs into. The people it was meant to organize didn't much care. French papermakers kept producing what their presses and molds were already built for. The decree existed on paper, which is a kind of irony, but compliance was inconsistent. The standard survived as an official aspiration more than a physical reality. The deeper conflict, though, was happening in the geometry itself. What should a rational paper size actually look like? The metric system offered a base unit, but a base unit alone doesn't tell you the shape of a rectangle. And shape matters enormously because of a property that most people have never consciously noticed but use every time they fold a sheet of paper in half. If you fold a rectangle along its long axis, you get a smaller rectangle. The question is whether that smaller rectangle has the same proportions as the one you started with. Most historical paper sizes did not. Fold a sheet of letter paper, the American standard, in half and you get a rectangle with completely different proportions. It doesn't scale. That asymmetry is not a flaw most people ever notice. But one person did, and what he wrote down in 1786 would take over a century to matter. Georg Christoph Lichtenberg was a German physicist, best known in his own time as a satirist and aphorist. In a letter dated October 25, 1786, written to Johann Beckmann, he described a geometric property he had noticed. If you want a rectangle that produces a smaller version of itself when folded in half, the ratio of its sides must be 1 to the square root of 2, approximately 1 to 1.4142. He wasn't proposing a paper standard. He was describing a mathematical curiosity. The letter sat in archives and was not widely circulated. Over a century later, in 1922, the German engineer Walter Postmann built on this ratio to design a complete paper size system for the Deutsches Institut für Normung, the German standards body known by its initials as DIN. Postmann's system started with a single sheet of 1 square meter in area, shaped to the square root of 2 ratio, and then divided it in half repeatedly to produce every smaller size. The largest was A0, 1 square meter. Fold it in half and you get A1, fold that and you get A2. Each step down preserves the ratio and halves the area. The logic was almost musical in its consistency. DIN adopted it as DIN 476 in 1922. The German adoption created immediate economic pressure on neighboring countries. A document printed in Berlin on A4 paper could be filed in a folder designed for A4, mailed in an envelope designed for A4, and reproduced on a press calibrated for A4. Anyone trading with Germany had a practical reason to align. By 1975, the ISO, the International Organization for Standardization, had codified the system as ISO 216, and country after country formally adopted it. Today, A4 is the standard in over 160 countries. The Lichtenberg ratio, jotted down in a private letter in 1786, is now the invisible geometry of virtually every office on Earth. There was a rival, and it came embarrassingly close to winning. In the United States, the standard office paper size was 8 by 10.5 inches, used by the federal government as early as 1921. In 1980, under President Ronald Reagan's administration, an effort to cut bureaucratic costs identified paper size as a legitimate efficiency problem. The government was using multiple formats across different agencies, creating waste in printing, storage, and procurement. A committee recommended moving to 8.5 by 11 inches, the size now called letter, and standardizing across all federal agencies. The motivation was administrative tidiness, not geometry. There was a parallel push at exactly the same moment to adopt A4 instead, the ISO standard already in use by most of America's trading partners. The argument was straightforward. International documents, trade correspondence, legal filings with foreign courts, and technical manuals would all be easier to produce and reproduce if the US used the same sheet as everyone else. The State Department reportedly supported the switch. Several large corporations that operated internationally had already quietly moved their internal communications to A4. Letter 1, the reason was not technical. It was inertia made institutional. The filing cabinets, the printer trays, the pre-cut paper stock, the binders, the copiers, all of it was already built for 8.5 by 11. Switching would have meant replacing infrastructure across thousands of government offices and hundreds of millions of homes. The cost of transition outweighed the cost of isolation. In 1996, the US government formally standardized on letter and legal sizes. The A4 window closed. Canada, which had used letter sizes informally for decades due to its deep economic integration with the United States, also never adopted ISO 216 as a practical standard, despite being an ISO member. Mexico officially uses A4 by ISO standard, but still regularly prints on letter-sized paper due to the same cross-border supply chain logic. The Americas, in effect, formed their own accidental block, not by design but by the weight of existing equipment. Here is where all of it lands right now in your hands. If you pull a sheet of A4 paper from a ream, the kind sold in Europe, Australia, Japan, almost anywhere outside North America, and you fold it in half along the long edge, the rectangle you're holding is A5. Same proportions, fold it again and you have A6. The shape never changes, only the scale. That is the Lichtenberg ratio, quietly present in every fold. It's a piece of mathematics from a private letter written in 1786 that most people have touched 10,000 times without knowing its name. If you're in the United States and you fold a sheet of letter paper in half, the proportions shift. The result is not a scaled-down letter. It's a different shape, not worse, just not self-similar. That asymmetry is the trace of the moment in 1980 when a cost-cutting committee chose infrastructure over geometry, and the world's largest economy locked itself into a dimension that doesn't scale. Every time a document designed for A4 prints slightly wrong on a letter-size sheet, a little truncated at the bottom, a little cramped at the margins, that is a 1922 German engineering decision meeting a 1980 American procurement decision, and neither one yielding. The paper in your printer is not a neutral object. It is the physical record of an argument that was never quite resolved, still playing out every time you hit print.